Rather than seeing people as institutions do, as a role with a certain set of rules that are governing those roles, extitutional lenses look to your full person and the resonance and relationships that can be developed between those full people.
Hello everyone, welcome to the ReFi podcast. This is an exciting episode and also the last one of our economic and system thinking mini-series. We had the pleasure to welcome Tony Lai, the co-steward of Meta Tree Labs and a fellow at Stanford's Codex. Tony has a rich background in law and technology and works at the intersection of computational law, commons governance, and ecological transition. Tony shared some powerful ideas with us today, including a beautiful definition of how ReFi is all about giving our attention, awareness, and resources to what we really value.
Yeah, the conversation with Tony felt truly magical. What really stood out to me was his extitutional approach to how traditional ways we understand politics, privilege, and our relationship to Earth. Tony does really inspiring work with the goal of creating a more mindful economy and shares beautiful tips for personal regeneration as well. So let us know what you think in the comments and share this episode with your community. Let's dive in. Hi, Tony. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Maya. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you, Tereza, for having me.
We're excited to have you here, Tony. So as the co-steward of Meta Tree Labs and fellow at Stanford Codex, you've been involved in very diverse teams related to, ecoweaving, decentralized systems, and computational law. So we are really excited to explore these topics in more depth today. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Tony. And before we jump into the questions, I wanted to ask you for something special for our audience. When I watched your presentation at the Fund in the Commons in Berlin, you started out with a beautiful community meditation. And I wonder, as an experiment, if you would like to ground us in a short practice of your choice before we jump into all the nitty-gritty of our questions.
Thank you, Maya, Tereza. Well, if I could invite you both, and if the audience feel comfortable, closing your eyes, I'm just going to take a moment to pause and connect. And sense into how we all are at this moment, as with every moment, sharing the air around us. If we breathe in that breath, we can feel how it sustains the life of each and every one of us. This invisible commons that the earth regenerates for us every single day. We can know it in many ways. We can feel its pressure and flow. We can measure its components, and we can perhaps attach value to the absence of pollutants. And we know it with our bodies. Our body knows what to do with it. This kind of knowing that we've carried with us since our first breath, as have all our ancestors. And we can know that with our ancestral mind, our dreaming, regenerative kinship mind, that we have on average one atom in our body from every breath that every human has ever taken. And as we open our eyes now, I'd like us to honor this regenerative thread that connects us all. And Maya, Tereza, I'm so grateful that you're weaving me into your threads now. And I hope our audience can feel woven into a pattern of regeneration through this podcast and through the breath that is coming alive in every single one of us around the world. And I think that's one of the things that I have taken back from my journeys to the Amazon, which has been this life-restoring, regenerative breath creator for all of us for so long. As with all of the trees and all of the life on Earth, it's part of this wonderful regenerative flow that we're a part of. And it's beautiful to feel truly a part of that through little practices like this, but also through these kinds of conversations. So I'm very grateful to be here.
Tony, thank you so much. Extremely powerful. And I think this is a great base for our conversation. Also, I have to say you have the most beautiful voice. Really nice hearing it. So to get started, can you share with us a little bit about your background, a little bit about your journey? As I mentioned, you have a background in different disciplines. So how did this all come together?
My parents gave me a name in Chinese called, the characters frame out, Li Jiahao. Li is the surname. It's the first half of the two-character word for dawn. So it's sort of darkness, brightness, Li Ming. It also means earth, heavens. So my surname sort of means darkness or earth. And then my middle name, Jia, means family or kin. And then my given name, Hao, which means brightness on its own. But if you break apart the two parts, it means a pure lawyer or pure voice. And I asked my parents, why did you give me this name? Did you know that it meant this? No, it was just like the way it sounded. And they never forced me to do anything in particular. They just, wanted me to be happy and brilliant. And I found out later that, dragon parents often give you this sense of needing to be brilliant to be loved. And I have been through my own process of care and compassion, working through that so that, I don't constantly try and be brilliant all the time. And I think that's a part of everyone's journey, is to figure out one's own self-regard. Your parents have all these expectations for you, maybe. And I did become a lawyer, and I do have this voice, I guess. But seeing myself as this idea, a pure voice for the family of the darkness before dawn, or pure lawyer of the earthkin. Looking back now, 40 something years later, I can see how, I've been through various ups and downs and, kind of veered from, some very fixed defined course. I've done many varied things, but to land here now and to be seen by people like yourself and others as a lawyer who is working for the family of the earth, a lawyer who's working for the earthkin and trying to gather earthkin and help everyone be empowered through law and everything that law is becoming. It's been an interesting journey from regarding myself also as an outsider, someone with Asian skin in a predominantly white society in England, and figuring out the games that can be played in order to get inside all of the different systems, whether it's academia or law or, finance or startup world. All of these have their own systems that have been set up with their various different rules. And I think part of my journey has been figuring out that game to be able to get in on the inside, because I think it is all a game at the end of the day. There's all these rules that have been set up, and it's a life and death game oftentimes. But I think having found my way inside a lot of these systems, I've started to understand how people play roles when they're inside these systems and when they're inside these games. And if one can become aware of that game and become aware of the roles that different people are playing, it becomes less intimidating. It becomes less threatening. One can play the game, but also one can step outside the game for a moment and invite people outside of the game and be present as a whole human being, just a being even, just a life, a consciousness, and finding the little, I call them lines of flight. It's like the architectural thing. You're seeking to move into a different perspective or open up a different dimension from the one that's apparent. And I think that more than anything else has been the most joyous part of my journey of late, which is finding these lines of flight to extitutionally connect, outside of the institution, but in this sort of relational, resonant way. And for that, music has been an incredible part of my life as well, outside of law. I've had the joy of learning fairly early on, but also then letting go of a lot of the things I'd learned and moving into the improvisational space, the uncertainty space, which again, I think can be very daunting sometimes, but a journey of learning to step into uncertainty has certainly been helped by my music. And so, that's a sort of very vague sort of like pulling many threads. I can go into specifics, obviously, but if anything there interests you, I'm happy to go into further detail.
Yeah, there's totally a few things that I would like to discuss. It definitely takes a lot of courage to maybe step outside of the game and the roles that we are sometimes, forced to assume, I guess, in our lives. But one role that caught my attention is being the lawyer for Earth. Maybe can you explain to our audience and to everyone that might be interested, why does Earth need a lawyer?
Law has been a practice, a process, a set of rituals, and in many ways a belief system that has variously been interwoven with religion, with politics, with economics, with society as a whole, how we go about cooperating, how we go about coordinating, but also how we go about enforcing and punishing and saying this is good and this is bad, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. And murder, theft, the harms and hurts that we can cause each other intentionally or unintentionally have been crafted and turned into a set of dynamics that has done many, many wonderful things for our world, our society. And, principles of fairness, principles of justice, these have been embedded so that we can have a certain level of certainty about how we interact with each other. If you go somewhere and you know that there is a frame of decency, of right relationship, of right doing, right action, all of these help one to have a sense of safety, security, trust, and open into the kinds of dynamics that we want to see in the world: love and respect and honor and solace for loss. Unfortunately, law has also been used to establish certain rules of certain kinds of games that are potentially less conducive towards certain kinds of well-being. And primarily, when we think about the earth, law has considered it to be an object. Mostly, it's considered it to be a resource that one can extract from. And the dynamic of relating to the earth is a little bit like the dynamic that we related to slaves once upon a time. Slavery is property. Slavery is an object that you can extract from. It doesn't matter how much hurt or suffering you cause the slave. You can kill the slave. Nobody's going to come and do anything to you, because by law, that slave was your legal property. And obviously there were some variations in, the laws around how you could treat your slave. So it wasn't a complete blank slate in some societies that were moving towards a little bit of compassion for these clearly human beings. But again, the frame of law led many people to think, oh, I can do whatever I want to these people. And, massive amounts of suffering was done over hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years. Now, the challenge is we're still treating Earth very much like a slave, and the law, similarly to how it treated slaves, sees the land, the earth, as something that we can rape, pillage, and extract from endlessly. And part of our understanding over the last few decades, last 100 years certainly, is that this is not an unlimited pool of slaves that we can endlessly pillage from. The ocean is not going to just keep soaking up all of the plastics that we melt into it. I learned something recently from someone called Junyun. He's a leader of a large hedge fund here in Silicon Valley, but he's also invested a lot in developing healthcare systems and from longevity to nutrition. And he's thinking about the environment as well. And one thing he said was that plants have their own stress hormone, just like we have cortisol. And we generate cortisol and it creates various inflammation in our bodies. Plants have their own stress hormone. All plants share this stress hormone. And that hormone is, that chemical is ethylene. And it's also the most common chemical that we produce from the oil industry. It's the most common chemical we produce around the world. So this stress hormone that plants use in order to ripen, but also as an indicator to each other when, things are coming, like fire, for example, they'll indicate to each other, right? Get ready for stress. Drop all of your fruit. Try and move into, they brown. And we are producing millions and millions and millions of tons of this stress hormone into plastics, and it's melting in the ocean. It's just releasing. And these are he described it as the molecular screams of trees. We are solidifying the molecular screams of trees, and then we're dissolving them in the oceans, and then we're letting it out. So it's no wonder that the plants around us, the earth as a whole, is feeling like Armageddon is coming, right? And, this is another version of this, unconscious enslavement and harm and suffering that we're impacting on the earth. And that's, in a sense, all very much premised upon a legal system that justifies purely treating earth as property that can be extracted from, and the ways that we set up our economic, financial, social, political systems are all premised upon this legal basis. And I think we can shift that now. I think that lawyers around the world are realizing that, property is not necessarily the be all and end all of a system on which we want to premise everything. There are dynamics where conviviality, buen vivir, right living, a good life, a mindful economy. I was with the King of Bhutan recently, who's developing this beautiful idea for a mindful city in Bhutan. And the legal system that we will be setting up there will be premised on completely different foundations. And the opportunity to set up an entirely new jurisdiction is a fascinating one for us as a regenerative community to, I think, hold on to. And so, yeah, I'm very excited by all the opportunities that new kinds of reckonings and approaches with law can offer our regenerative movement. So it's not all doom and gloom.
Wow, beautifully said. And I didn't know about that stress hormone piece in plants and the connection to oil. That's super interesting. And I like what you said, that we need law to establish these frames of decency, right? But also your approach to changing the game. And it sounds like that you are focusing on that, changing those rules that you're working at Stanford. So can you talk a bit more about your experience in academia and how your time at Stanford influence your understanding of computational law and its role in regenerative systems?
Sure. I can talk more generally about academia, and then I can offer a little bit specific about Stanford. I've had the privilege, thanks to some wonderful teachers who I want to honor. Dr. Hyde and Dr. Fern were my history teachers at high school, and they gave me the belief that I could go and find my way into these privileged institutions. So I started off at Oxford at undergrad, and later on, after being a lawyer, I had the chance to go to Stanford. And, in a sense, these kind of represent these kind of versions of ivory towers that operate in a sense as these centers of privilege more than anything else. They train people to be certainly brilliant in their respective fields, but more than anything else, I found that they taught people how to be privileged, which is a very interesting dynamic, right? Because privilege, almost by its nature, represents some kind of inequality. It's sort of embedded in the word itself, right? And yet, what might it look like for us all to be royal? What might it look like for us all to have these kinds of privileges and capacities to be able to, and I started it off by saying, understanding how to play the game or play, any game. And I think part of it is also training yourself as a player of games generally. And so academia gives you this, certain kinds of academia, I guess, give you this view in. And I think our blockchain movement, one of the things that I'm very interested in is how we translate these kinds of modalities of privilege into a much more inclusive, accessible set of patterns. What does it look like to be able to open up a sense of privilege to everyone in our community? What does it look like to open up that feeling of empowerment? And I think that's where law can really come in, and where the tools of computational law are starting to open up what was once a very gated, esoteric field where you had to know all of these sort of different dynamics of, a very complex system. I think what computation does in general is it opens up that complexity to a greater level of interface and a greater level of machine readability. It's not just machine readability. Once it's read, it's able to be processed and reasoned with, comprehended. And even before blockchain, this is then turning to the Stanford piece. Stanford was working on various different aspects of computational law at a center called Codex. Originally, it was called the Center for Computational Law. Now we've moved into a sort of more broader dimension of legal informatics, which looks at the science of information flow. And so computation is one part of a process for informational analysis and usage within these mechanisms we've had for nearly a century now that allow for machines to be supporting us as brains with some of the more repetitive drudgery work, let's say. And certainly there's a lot of drudgery work if you practiced as a lawyer 10 years ago. I was practicing maybe 15 years ago in a big law firm. But certainly one of the things that law firms had made a lot of money over was the fact that there's a lot of repetitive work and you charge by the hour, but there was no other way than to do the repetitive work sort of thing. And I think computational law starts to threaten that. And one of the first things I did out of being at Stanford, I was part of this wonderful center. I helped set up a startup accelerator called StartX. But off the back of that, I set up a company, legal.io. We were originally called Law Gives. And a big part of that was how do we take this technology, this capacity to compute and automate and bring it into the legal system in the areas where people really are struggling. There's this notion of the justice gap where you're not poor enough to qualify for free help, but you're not rich enough to pay the $200-300 an hour that you need for a lawyer. And so this gap I felt like was, very much where computation and automation could play a role. And when blockchain came in, it just started taking that to the next level, because open sourcing a lot of these templates, these forms that, can be encoded as smart contracts, the fact that those were open source now with blockchain and they could operate on these permissionless public blockchains and people could set up their federated layer 2s and like local communities that could interoperate with this larger security dynamic of an Ethereum or, some other layer 1 blockchain that was universally accessible and that couldn't be censored or shut down. I mean, again, this opened up this completely new dynamic to how these automation tools that could give privilege to everyone in the right, frame, how they could suddenly then be copied and replicated and proliferated. And so it wasn't then about scaling. It wasn't then about building the largest platform, building the Amazon for law anymore. It was about replicating, proliferating. And this movement from scaling to replicating and proliferating, I think, is the movement from Silicon Valley Web 2.0 to, global majority Web 3.0. So I don't know if I answered your question. I think this is all sort of Stanford-esque stuff because, Stanford as a sort of the heart of Silicon Valley is something so unique. They operate in this bubble of, again, privilege of a sort, but it's like privilege that's moved from the British Empire to the American Empire. And now the American Empire is founded on technology that dominates the global economy in various different ways, right? And, there's various different, pushbacks against that from China and elsewhere. Europe has its, attempts but Web 2 was really the age of America and Silicon Valley. And to be there when, Airbnb was taking off and Facebook was, Mark Zuckerberg lived next door to my co-founder at Legal.io for a little while, just, on the side of Stanford campus. And, you were brushing shoulders with all of these people you don't know might have been building the next, global mega capitalist endeavor to, take over the world. And so you're there and you're meeting these people and you're hearing about their ideas and everybody's able to share their ideas. Everybody listens to your ideas. And it's a great training in listening. Certainly as an English person coming to America, one of the most interesting things was how everybody had a story. Everybody had their own story. And it's a uniquely individualist society where you're taught that if you don't have your own story, then you're nobody. Whereas I think in many other cultures, there's maybe a greater leaning into collective stories and community stories and societal stories, but maybe sometimes at the expense of like not developing your own individual story and sort of losing yourself. And so it's a very interesting balance, right? There's no single right way, but I feel like with our ReFi future, with our regenerative future, we can maybe take a leaf out of both books and enable both agency as well as belonging in the context of care.
I feel like I relate to that a lot, and Maya probably as well. I think those are some Eastern European experiences as well that one has growing up and kind of fitting in a society. But it's really interesting to see how the structures that you mentioned are shifting, and I think all of us can agree that it's about time they shifted. So I want to know, what's the role of Mother Tree Labs in that as well? What is the future that you're envisioning with that project?
Well, thank you. I want to give a lot of credit to my co-founder, Susanna Eichler, who's a filmmaker, storyteller, and has been thinking about the mythologies of our regenerative future for some time. She worked originally in TV and then marketing and large branding agencies, but then shifted her work into impact and was working with Christiana Figueres on some of the global goals work, as well as making films about, how we save the oceans. She was putting on these large physical environments outside the UN, these huge tents that gave people a sense of the air quality in different cities. And I think for me, being able to take a step back from my sort of academic and research and blockchain computational law infrastructure world and step into the world of mythology, mythmaking, convening, facilitating, a lot of what Mother Tree Labs represents is a step away from the yang and the solution-focused techno-determinist approach that I think I had been inculcated into as a result of my 12, 13 years in Silicon Valley before I met Susanna. I'd been inculcated in this very solution-focused approach where we can fix anything. And the idea was very much in the flow of Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. We held a gathering at a hot springs just north of here that our community stewards called Wilbur Hot Springs. And he was at COP in Glasgow with myself and Will Marshall, my housemate in San Francisco. And he was saying how all of these policymakers had been coming up to him, having read Ministry for the Future, this book about sort of how we save the world from the climate disaster, but a lot of bad things happen in the run up to that. But it's a hopeful story nevertheless. And so policymakers were coming to him and saying, how do we do this? You've written so beautifully about this future. And he's like, I'm a science fiction writer. I don't do policy. I'm sorry. But he was talking to Will about this, and Will, as one of my dearest friends, and he runs Planet Labs, a big space company that's using satellites to help life on Earth. And he, again, was like, let's gather together our Silicon Valley brethren and let's think about this. And so I think that the origins was in this sort of very solution-focused dynamic. And we had another gathering called eco-coins, because carbon coin is a big idea in Ministry of the Future. And so we talked about eco-coins. And this was just off the back of this initial Ministry for the Future gathering. And then Susanna kind of helped me think through what was to become Mother Tree Labs. And she was saying, I think we need to make more space for the yin. We need to create space for nurturing and nourishing. And, this was also very much influenced by a lot of the other beautifully strong female-bodied people at that EcoCoin gathering. Tenzin Selden, Atosh Soltani, Jihana, Rita, just a lot of powerful women who were saying this energy needs evolving, in the kindest possible way. But they were very direct with me. And I went away with Susanna, and we worked on what was to become Mother Tree Labs, which is an educational nonprofit around not just the regenerative finance, infrastructure, computational law pieces, but also the convening, the mythology, the rituals, the storytelling, the dynamics of holding and co-creating that Susanna brings in spades, and that I've learned so much from so many other people. And in that sense, we're building out Mother Tree Labs to be a collective where people who are working as bridges across these different domains can belong together, can work together, can create convenings and research and smart contract templates and local community currencies together that are founded upon these more fundamental ideas and stories and practices of regeneration, and not just the infrastructure and the solutions. Because, and again, a big part of this was guided by the people that we met along the way. And so the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance is a group that I referenced in the Funding the Commons talk that you mentioned right at the beginning. And they held us in a space of knowing and unlearning and remembering that, again, feeds into the pattern of holding and nurturing space for those who have not had a chance to be at the table yet. And their encounters with the modern world has very much been about the modern world bringing a solution and imposing it upon them, and them not having had the chance to have their voice at the table. And so Mother Tree Labs seeks to right that balance somewhat, and we're learning along the way, and we're trying to do our best to learn out loud.
I really like that point. And, solutionism, I feel like, is a fallacy that a lot of people in the West take on. So bringing those people to the table rather than imposing solutions is a very important task to be done. I'm really looking forward to seeing what Mother Tree Labs is up to. And when you're talking about this, you mentioned regenerative finance, and obviously the name of the podcast is ReFi Podcast. And, with this season, we are hoping to expand on the definitions of this concept. So I'm curious, what does regenerative finance mean to you, and why is it important in today's economy?
You'll forgive me, please, for reframing finance as a function of law, just because of my background, right? So money as a instrument is ultimately just a very simplified form of contract. It's like, I give you this dollar, you give me that thing, right? It's a very simple contract. The beautiful thing about finance when on the blockchain is that we can be a little bit more nuanced with our contracts, and be a little bit more clever, a little bit more regenerative with our money. And so the opportunity for regenerative finance builds upon everything that I was saying about law. And it's just a version of a very commonly understood, well-memified simple contract. Smart, but simple and understandable so that it's memifiable, right? And we can have beautifully memified local currencies. And I think this local piece is critical, because my imagination around regenerative finance involves a lot of reconnecting with the local. And when I say local, I mean land. I mean the physical earth that we can get our hands into and heal ourselves through the process of re-engaging with. But then it also means local in the guild sense, because we have these new senses of locality with our sort of modern nomadacy, right? And local can actually mean like, where do you feel at home? You know, where do you feel like you belong? And I think that aspect of local is the internet version of local. And we find our pockets of friends and unique affinities, often across geographic boundaries. And these newer modern guilds are the kinds of intersections between that local biophysical DAO and the sort of like the guild-based DAO that Austin Wade Smith writes beautifully in his Mirror post on connecting biophysical and digital linkages. And that piece then goes on to a follow-up paper on ecological institutions, which we held a gathering at Stanford on just before the Earth Commons gathering in Berkeley that you were both at. And so the piece around regenerative finance comes into its own when you start presencing these linkages into the biophysical and the sort of guild-like DAOs that come together and allow us to have much more nuanced identity and belonging. And when I talk about nuance, I'm talking about what we get to value, what we get to intentionally hold in our awareness. And at the end of the day, you know, contracts, money, platforms, they're all about directing our attention, our awareness, and our resources. That's what made Facebook what it is, right? That's what, in a sense, is what's making Amazon the behemoth that it is. It's captured our awareness and the flow of resources. The potential and the imagination space we get to play with within the regenerative finance movement is to take a local city like Recife, for example, where my friend Camila has just signed a cooperation agreement with them to, you know, figure out how they might take their local social currency that they currently already have, that's premised upon, you know, getting credits from doing wellness and sports activities and then being able to spend them on health and wellness. Very, very tight, you know, very, very extremely local dynamic. But like, what might it look like to then layer on top of that? Oh, you can get credits by going to your local park and maybe helping out with the local river cleanup or planting some trees or other kinds of uplift that are clearly helping your local community with various different aspects of community health. And then premising a currency not just on your individual health, but on your community health. And understanding the memes around how this value is actually affecting your life for the positive. I think money can be not just a smart contract, but it can be a smart node for us to shift our awareness on what we choose to focus on as well. And so instead of, you know, your, you know, latest shitcoin, we're starting to move towards compost coins, right? Because compost coins are actually part of a cycle, and shit doesn't just disappear down the loo. It actually feeds back into the ecosystem.
I love how you put that. That's awesome. I wonder, like, in your journey, you know, like throughout like regenerative systems and regenerative finance communities and everything that you kind of seen and lived, what was the most surprising thing that you found out, like either positive or negative?
I haven't mentioned New Zealand much yet. Aotearoa, this is the original name, Land of the Long White Cloud. And I was invited down there to spend more time down there by the folks at the Edmund Hillary Fellowship. And I want to give credit to the Monahan brothers and Joseph Fayele and Rosalind and all of the team who founded and set that up for having the foresight to bring together a group of impact-minded folks, many of whom are working on various different ReFi pieces, to New Zealand to center their work in many ways from that beautiful land. And for me, one of the most surprising things about thinking about and practicing and doing the work that we're doing from that basis was how important engaging with the past and history is with actually setting up the potentials for the future. And in New Zealand, they've done a really, really amazing institutional job. And it's not perfect by any means, but they've done a really good institutional job of engaging with the trauma of their colonial past. They have set up these tribunals that have started giving land back to the indigenous Maori peoples who, and it's a fraction of the value of what was stolen. Let's be clear, right? There's no full making up for, you know, the murder and the pillage and the, you know, taking of lands that happened, but there have been reckonings, and they've been embraced and backed by the government, and every different party is actually basically bound by, political and social conscience not to go back on these tribunals. And so that process has led to a whole series of situations where the land itself has been given the opportunity to be a person in the eyes of the law. We have had, for the first time, a mountain, a river, and a forest in Aotearoa being given legal personhood. And this is a direct result of this reckoning with history. And the indigenous peoples themselves, when they were given the land back, in these cases, not every case, but in these cases, we don't want to be given this land back in the model of your Western legal system, where it will be divided up and it will be turned into these tiny little plots that we're all going to fight over and that we won't have any common interest in. We want this land to be given back, and we want it turned from private land or national park or whatever you did under your Western system. We want it turned back into something that represents our indigenous worldview. And that is that this land is an ancestor. This land belongs to itself, and we are stewards and carers for this land. And for me to witness that and to feel that and to be with the people who told the stories and who had carried the stories in their own ways for generations and generations, and they could take us onto the top of the mountain and say, look over there. That is our great-great-grandfather. And this is the story that led our ancestors to go there and, map this out. And the connection and the relationality that you see as a result of how the legal combines with the mythological, combines with the political, and we're in the early stages here, but could then serve as the foundation for the economic. I think that for me was one of the most beautiful and surprising things that I have experienced in this ReFi movement. And it's really what I want to try and offer space to nurture and grow everywhere around the world. And we're seeing these rights of nature movements happening. And the Earth Law Center in Colorado has just started this new Earth Law apprenticeship program that myself and Jessie Kate Shingler, another dear chosen family member, we've together started with Grant and the team there at the Earth Law Center. And that's in the hope that anybody in the world might consider themselves worthy of being an Earth lawyer. And here's the thing, we've created a path that doesn't require you to go to law school. You can continue being an activist. You can continue being a ReFi frontline expert. You can continue being a smart contract creator. You don't need to go to law school. You just need to do the work. And if you can get 2 years worth of relevant work experience anywhere in the world with up to 4 different organizations, then you can be eligible then to take the bar exam in the UK. And that's not easy. You'll need to study and get up to speed with that. And there are various different courses and things like that, but you don't need to pay $50,000 to go to law school, let's say. And so this is a new path that we're nurturing with the Earth Law Center to try and help everyone see the possibilities of what law can do in their local communities and even potentially become a fully qualified lawyer as well. And so, please, if folks are interested in this pathway, you can look up Earth Law Apprenticeship Program on your favorite search engine and find out more. And feel free to get in touch as well.
And we'll make sure to add all those links to the episode description. I'm so inspired by these initiatives. And speaking of the local, can you talk a bit more? How do you envision this community-led and driven governance playing a role in shaping future economic systems? And speaking of the traditional institutions, right? The word you used earlier is extitutional. So what are the key elements of such extitutional approach and why?
Thank you for that question. I've been playing with Primavera de Filippi and Jessica Shingler and many others, but especially with this initial core crew on this concept of extitutional theory since the early pandemic. And we were fortunate to all be gathered together at the Chateau du Fay in France, which holds this periodic intentional community gathering called Faytopia that I welcome any of your listeners to apply to come and join. And there'll be many other local community dynamics like that, I think, of people living together, where people can build the relationality and the resonance that allows each other to see each other as whole people. And I think this is one of the most beautiful places and dynamics to sort of enshrine this idea of extitutional dynamics. And again, this is rather than seeing people as institutions do as a role with a certain set of rules that are governing those roles, extitutional lenses look to your full person and the resonance and relationships that can be developed between those 4 people. It's a very high level sort of contrast. And But at the end of the day, what does it mean? It means actually practicing and living together. And I think that resonance of living together, of being together, and of seeing each other as whole humans, I've recently sort of articulated in slightly more finer detail as part of a series of attunement practices. Attunement is something that we do as musicians. And this is where I start then bringing in the music and the governance and how these two parts of me fit together. But I feel like extitutional governance comes about through attunement and resonance. And whenever we seek to do any systems change work, whenever we seek to make any kind of decision together, whenever we seek to resolve any kind of dispute, I think a lot of indigenous cultures, a lot of traditional cultures have actually understood this deeply, and we've kind of lost it and we're remembering it. But take the time to attune first. Take the time to breathe together. Take the time to sing together. Take the time to dance together. Take the time to tell some jokes together. Do some improv together. These are completely, beyond the pale in a lot of different situations. But sometimes when one is actually able to do this and be in a slightly more vulnerable dynamic, but you're stepping outside of the rules of the game, right? But you're inviting other people to do that. And once you are able to do that and set an attunement, it's amazing what can then come after that. And I think this is one of the pieces of this future of the regenerative movement that we're going to be able to really play out is, what does it look like to have somatic facilitators, to have musical, artistic creators come and be a part of our communities and help us with these attunement processes before we get into the governance and the finance and the technical infrastructure pieces and the voting. Voting is not the be all and end all. Voting cannot be the be all and end all. We have to bring it way back before the voting and actually attune. And I think this is the reason why so many of our initial DAO experiments failed, because we were putting so much emphasis on how the technical tools could solve politics, whereas politics can never be solved with technical tools. It's about our beings and our bodies and our relating as consciousness, as whole high bandwidth consciousness, right? And that's what being on the land and being in person and local and tying our regenerative finance futures to local regenerative food systems projects, to local land regeneration. This is how all of this DeFi chain fair future comes about, is through that somatic grounding, right? And so I see that as a big part of our hopeful vision. I see the hope coming through in terms of our capacity to feel and resonate and sing together, and the joy that we can actually manifest through our interpersonal neurobiology. It's nervous system co-regulation. It's that kind of regulation that we're talking about. Before we regulate our societies, let's just regulate our nervous systems, right? And we can co-regulate together and heal from a whole bunch of our traumas, from not having the best secure attachments in our childhoods. I mean, hurt people. I mean, I had the most wonderful parents, but there was a little bit of a dragon parent aspect about them, and it kind of had its effects on me, and it took me some time to heal from that. And in the meantime, I probably hurt a bunch of people through just being too in their face, and I was a million miles an hour. And sure, I intimidated people, but this is because I had a certain kind of but to be able to unfurl and unfold into spaces where people are holding you for the wholeness of who you are, and maybe questioning you, maybe, a little bit of incisive, poking, but, in the most caring and compassionate way. I think that's where we get to restart and remember.
Tony, you're really speaking my language here. I can really relate to what you're saying. And I think regeneration also comes with personal and relational regeneration. So that's really powerful. And, leaving the ego behind, or at least reframing it in a certain way. What is maybe one self-regeneration practice that you would recommend to our listeners?
Gosh, self-regeneration practices. Singing, going into the forest and singing to the trees. I mean, you get double goodness there, because Shirin Roku, it's the Japanese word for tree bathing, and you're essentially bathing in these phytochemicals that the trees produce that are incredibly good for our nervous system. And Japanese doctors actually give prescriptions to employees to take to their bosses and say, my doctor gave me a prescription. I must spend a day in the forest. It's for my good health. And then if you sing in the forest as well, then you're actually practicing this voice that we each have. And I think singing is one of the most restorative practices for one's nervous system. And you can do it by yourself. And that's a great way of just starting off, because, no one's listening except the trees, and the trees love listening, and the trees don't care how good you think you are, because however we sing, the trees interpret it as vibrational goodness. And then a really good one is to actually hug a tree and sing. And this is starting to get slightly, hippie kooky, but I'm serious here, because if you hug a tree and it's tall enough, you can actually hear it singing back, because they move in the wind, and they kind of croak and groan. And then sometimes there's a bit of a high pitch of, and then you just tune in and you start singing back, and you're suddenly you're singing with the trees.
I love it. And I'm all for the hippie stuff. Hugging trees, singing with the trees. It's such a beautiful practice recommendation. Thank you. And moving beyond personal regeneration, if you could inspire one action from every listener today to support this regenerative movement beyond self-regeneration, what would it be?
This is maybe a bit of a nuanced one, but it's what comes to mind. And it's about the kinds of questions that we ask each other and how we hold space for questions that are maybe outside of the default mode network. So next time when you're in an environment where you're meeting somebody new, maybe instead of asking, what do you do? Ask something like, is there a river that you feel particularly close to? Or, I've just come from the mountains and, was wondering if you have any mountains that you like. Something that maybe takes someone out of their sort of networky mode, which is oftentimes this institutional dynamic that we end up in these situations, and try and resonate and reflect with someone on something that's outside of the rules a little bit. And it's wonderful to maybe be open to these yearnings that we all have to actually connect in slightly different ways. So yeah, just invite yourself to hold space for these other questions, and then maybe practice them the next time you get the chance.
I love that. And actually, whether I interact with new people or my friends and family, a question that I always like to ask is is there something you want to share with me that you feel like I don't know? Because it leads to such great conversations. So I would totally recommend that, creating space for something that we usually don't. So thank you for that insight. Awesome. Tony, we're almost at the end of the episode, sadly. There are so many things that I would still like to ask you. But one of the final things that we do is 3 rapid fire questions. So those are a little tricky, a little direct. Are you ready?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so what book are you currently reading?
I'm currently reading, let me get it. The Great Regeneration by Dawn Cox. He was at DWeb Camp, part of the decentralized food systems track, which was for the first time we had this food systems track at DWeb Camp. A whole bunch of farmers learning about decentralized technologies in the Redwoods up in Northern California. So I highly recommend your listeners come and join us at DWeb Camp next year, dwebcamp.org. There'll be more stuff on regeneration, and you'll get to meet wonderful people like Dawn, who's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll pencil it in. I haven't heard about that one yet. Second question is, what excites you the most about your work?
People. Getting to meet incredible, wonderful, beautiful people.
Love that. And finally, is there a mantra, concept, or quote that you feel has really shaped your life?
The latest one is, how do you attune to a paradox? So it's just a question to think about and ask others. It's a great one for parties.
Wow, Tony, you definitely are leaving us with a lot of thought-provoking questions to keep pondering about. And as we're wrapping up, like Tereza said, I wish we had 2 more hours to talk about all these things, but this is such a beautiful exploration into your personal journey and your work, and something that's beyond us. I'm so honored to have you on our show, and I can't wait for the listeners to engage with your work. We'll make sure to and all the links for people to check out what you're up to. Yeah, and again, thank you for these beautiful insights.
Thank you so much. To quote my friend Asa, I'm merely a mushroom, the sort of the flowering body of a much larger mycelium. And I'm very grateful that you both are now part of this mycelium together with me, and that we can go everywhere being mushrooming bodies, but part of this larger regenerative mycelium. So yeah, encourage all your listeners to myceliate as much as possible with us.
Thank you so much, Tony. We really appreciate it.
Namaste. Thank you.